The year is 1492. Christopher Columbus is about to embark on his world-shattering voyage to the Americas. And on his way to the coast, he stops off here at Granada. He's the honoured guest of a ceremony hosted by the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. They are celebrating a grand victory. Up until this day, Granada had been ruled by Muslims. But Isabella has managed to wrestle control from them. Ferdinand and Isabella's victory marks a turning point for Spain and for Europe. The Middle Ages are over, and the West is about to embark on a new epoch of power and discovery. We tend to think of this as the beginning of an era. In fact, it's the climax of a forgotten chapter in European history, the rise and fall of Islam in the West. It was Rudyard Kipling who wrote, "East is east and west is west, but never the twain shall meet." And it's a worldview that still has currency today. Islam and Christianity seem to have become ideological monoliths, citadels whose gates are firmly closed to one another. But they haven't always lived such separate lives. In the year 711 AD, Muslim forces invaded Spain and created a society so rich and so powerful it was the envy of the known world. This wasn't the rigid, ferocious Islam of our imaginations, but a progressive, sensuous, intellectually curious culture that for a number of spine-tingling years looked set to sweep through the whole of Europe. It is an incredible story, but one that has been systematically written out of history. After the Catholic monarchs took over the city of Granada, they began to destroy all evidence that the Muslims had ever been in Spain. In the following century, the Spanish authorities persecuted and expelled 300,000 Muslims and burned as many as 1 million Arabic books. This was an astonishing act of ethnic cleansing. It put an end to a civilization which had flourished in Spain for 700 years. These people have become known as the Moors. Propaganda, sparked by the Crusades, has given us an enduring image: the diabolical Moor, a dark-skinned, savage, alien enemy. But this character is a complete invention and tells us nothing about who these people really were. Now, archaeologists and historians are starting to piece together the real story of the Moors in Spain. They're uncovering the remains of hidden cities, discovering the role of Muslims in the revival of the classics, and decoding the meaning of Islamic buildings. A fascinating picture has emerged. I'm going to use this new research to explore what happened when East met West in Europe. If there is one place which challenges the stereotype of the treacherous, bloodthirsty Moor, it's here, the Alhambra Palace in Granada. The Alhambra is one of the most complete medieval Islamic palaces in the whole world. It was built by the Muslim kings of Granada in the 14th century, at the height of their power. Its name means the red one, because the dark surrounding soil has given its stones an earthy reddish hue. The marvel of the Alhambra is its mystery. Not a single account of life here survives. All its archives were incinerated in the fires of the Inquisition. But the Catholics couldn't bring themselves to destroy this place. The Alhambra is one of the wonders of the medieval world, and by preserving it, they've kept a box of secrets that we can use to decode the civilization that built it. Inside the palace walls, the architecture is breathtaking. Although the aesthetic of this courtyard is quite cool and minimal now, in its heyday it would have been a riot of colour. Granada was very famous for producing silks, and you've had silk hangings billowing in the breeze, and silk cushions and silk rugs where people laid out to eat their dinner and to listen to music. And in fact, it's only when you get down to rug level that you appreciate one of the bits of magic of the place, because from down here, this pool acts like a kind of infinity mirror, and the whole of the palace just looks as if it's suspended in water. Every detail of the palace decoration seems to be part of a scheme. Row upon row of intricate geometric patterns are carved into the woodwork of the walls and windows. This is the throne room. It was the symbolic centre of the palace, and here the Sultan had a kind of psychological advantage over his subjects. Whereas he'd have stood here in an eerie silhouette, they'd have been blinded by the light that came streaming in through these brightly coloured stained glass windows. The 19th century writer Washington Irving observed,
"It's impossible to contemplate this abode of Oriental manners without feeling the early association of Arabian romance. One almost expects to see some dark eye sparkling through the lattice. The abode of beauty is here, as if it had been inhabited but yesterday."
But this is far more than just a beautiful building. There's a specific reason why it feels so harmonious. The men who built it had a knowledge of complex geometry which had originated in the ancient world. The first man to set down these mathematical principles was the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. Pythagoras saw numbers everywhere in the universe, but his brilliance was to understand the importance of the ratio between them. Professor Antonio Fernandez Puertas has spent his life studying the Alhambra. He's discovered that the whole of the building, from the ground plan to the wall decoration, is based around one single ratio.
I think everything is so perfect because everything is under control of the proportion and very, very simple. You notice that there is something magic about these buildings. There is something marvelous in your surroundings.
It's very, very simple. It's the relation between the ground and the elevations of the buildings. It's as simple as that.
The king ordered a new palace. He has a limited area to build the palace. To west, east, and south, he was limited. Then he did something ingenious and beautiful.
The King of Granada asked his architects to harmonise each and every space within the palace according to a single set of proportions, a family of rectangles, each related to the other.
If you want to get proportional rectangle, you have the same base. Take the diagonal, put it up,
Yes.
and you got successive rectangle, proportional rectangle.
The key to the Alhambra's design is the simple relationship between the side of a square and its diagonal. If we use the diagonal to make a rectangle, and then the diagonal from that rectangle to make another, we get a progression of rectangles. The fourth rectangle is double the size of the first, and the diagonals in this sequence are in fact the square roots of 2, 3, 4 and 5. A magical sequence. And are they doing all this just with 2 set squares and a piece of string?
Yes.
That's very clever.
Yes.
Every part of the intricate network of spaces, all the courtyards, the hallways, the placement of every column was designed using inspired variations of this proportional system.
Proportion is also in the elevation. You have the kiosk. Here you build a square, and with the diagonal, you swing it up.
Nothing violated this incredibly elaborate system. The Alhambra is a triumph of mathematics as much as it is of aesthetics. Mathematical ingenuity is the root of its beauty. But no one talks about this. Everyone looks at the Alhambra just as an aesthetic experience.
When you go to a concert and you listen to Mozart, you listen Beethoven, you listen Verdi, you don't know perhaps music, but you notice that there is something magic.
Yes.
It happens with that the same. You feel it.
The Alhambra is so enchanting. It's all too easy to view it as a fairy tale palace, isolated from history. But that is romantic nonsense. This palace was the product of a very real, very gritty history. The Alhambra was built by a religious empire which, at the pinnacle of its power, dominated land from China to Africa. An empire which had the wealth and intellect to build such masterpieces. An empire whose history goes back to the deserts of 7th century Arabia. The Alhambra was the creation of the richest, most intellectually powerful civilization in the world. The roots of this cultural and religious explosion lie not in Spain, but in the deserts of Arabia. At the beginning of the 7th century in Saudi Arabia, something happened which was to change the religious makeup of the world forever. A merchant called Muhammad asserted that he had been visited by the Archangel Gabriel, who had revealed to him the true words of God. These revelations, which came to Muhammad throughout his life, became known as the Quran. And the religion was Islam. This was a time when people were experimenting with all sorts of cults and religions, many of which fell by the wayside. But the Prophet Muhammad and his followers made an important move. They travelled to a desert oasis where they founded a city called Medina. With a foothold in Medina, Islam was no longer just a nomadic desert cult. It had an urban centre with a social structure. As the religion grew bigger, so it grew more ambitious. Territorial expansion was a characteristic of nomadic Arabs well before the arrival of Muhammad. Tribal leaders would initiate razzia, or raids, on their neighbours. And with the advent of Islam, these gained some kind of spiritual significance. This is what one commander was reported to have said in one of the earliest ever Arabic chronicles. "This land is your inheritance and the promise of your Lord. You've been tasting it and eating from it. You have been killing its people and taking them into captivity. You are Arab chiefs and notables. If you renounce this world and aspire to the hereafter, God will give you this world and the hereafter." They believed they were inspired by the power of God. Within decades, Islamic Arabs had reached as far as Persia in the east. In the west, they'd conquered Egypt, Jordan, and much of North Africa, and were within spitting distance of Europe. But Islam wasn't only interested in territorial expansion. It was also a faith committed to the pursuit of learning. Among the Prophet's first revelations was the instruction, seek knowledge.
No.
This meant that from the very earliest days of Islam, literacy and religious study went hand in hand. Whereas a number of other religions of the day preferred to keep literacy the privilege of a clerical elite, Islam actively encouraged it. In the ancient Muslim city of Fez in Morocco, there are many examples of this unique integration of religion and education. This is the Karouin Mosque in Fez, and it's still the heart of religious life here. It was founded in 859 by a woman, both as a religious and as an educational establishment. Mosques were used for teaching grammar and literacy to ordinary people. In time, colleges, known as madrasas, were set up. This is the madrasa Bu Inania. Its walls are covered with the rich, rhyming prose of the Quran.
The mosque is only part of the complex, which contains both it and the madrasa. When the Sultan Abu Anan founded the place, he built the mosque alongside the madrasa. It is most symbolic. The mosque, built for prayer, was also a place which encouraged education and learning. As you can see, there is no separation. When the Quran was given to the Prophet, who was illiterate, the angel told him, read. These inscriptions carved onto the walls are verses of poetry and can be found throughout the madrasa. But I think the most important section is here. What it says in Arabic is, I am the apogee of knowledge. Come, you Muslims. Come and learn, because with knowledge you can become what you want to be in the future. During the medieval period, knowledge was high on the agenda in the Islamic world. Muslim societies produced many books in the various spheres of knowledge, and these books came to be known worldwide.
It wasn't just an enlightened attitude to reading which placed learning at the heart of the Islamic world. Necessity was also the mother of invention. Because the Arabs were nomads and desert traders who often had to travel in the cool of the night, they were well versed in using the stars as guiding devices. This developed into a very sophisticated study of astronomy. Then with the establishment of Islam, that knowledge was applied in a new way. Whenever a mosque was built, the prayer niche had to be orientated in direct relation to Mecca, and there were a number of religious festivals that had to fall on certain days in the lunar year. These were complex mathematical problems for which the Muslims devised precise solutions. Islam became a culture which naturally embraced scientific and mathematical investigation. This uninhibited attitude towards learning meant that when Muslims encountered the teachings of other cultures, they seized upon them vigorously. In the very early days of Islam, Muslims came into contact with a body of knowledge which had been ignored by most of Northern Europe for centuries. The works of the ancient Greeks. It's once you look at a globe that it becomes particularly easy to understand why the Arabs were such natural inheritors of Greek learning. From the Bronze Age onwards, there'd been a constant exchange of artifacts and information all across the Eastern Mediterranean. And in fact, a number of Greek ideas stem from Eastern and Egyptian influences. The bulk of this knowledge was preserved in the great schools and library at Alexandria. And then in 641 AD, the Arabs take over the city and at a stroke have direct access to this precious learning.
Many of these texts found their way to Fez. This is an Arabic translation of Aristotle with an additional commentary by the Muslim scholar Averroes.
The translation's done in Iraq, and then Averroes does this commentary in al-Andalus.
There's even an early Arabic translation of the Bible.
So it's extraordinary, isn't it? That Arabic's the lingua franca, and everybody's writing in Arabic, even the Bible.
And thus ends the Gospel of Mark the Apostle.
The contrast with Europe at this time could not have been greater. Here, ancient Greek texts and the rational investigation they contained were often feared as blasphemous.
When the Prophet Muhammad was born, Christianity had already been battling with paganism for 600 years, trying to persuade believers to turn away from their old gods to the one new God. And because of that, Christians were often suspicious of Greek and Roman pagan texts. For instance, in 529 AD, the Christian emperor Justinian closed down the Athenian schools of philosophy.
Set against this vibrant Islamic culture, Europe can appear an introspective and intellectually cautious place. It was certainly a continent in crisis.
After the fall of Rome, there was a power vacuum in Europe, with rival tribes squabbling for territories. It was the start of what later Christian scholars would describe as the Dark Ages.
While Europe lay unprotected and vulnerable, Islam was consolidating land and power. By the beginning of the 8th century, the Arabs had converted the Berber tribes at the very tip of North Africa. And before long, troops were gathered on the coast, their eyes fixed on Europe.
This little stretch of water between Spain and Morocco is only 9 miles wide, but it's come to represent some kind of cultural chasm between Europe and Africa. But in the 8th century, when sea travel was the way to get around, that wasn't a barrier, it was a highway.
In July 711, 7,000 Berber tribesmen stormed across the Straits of Gibraltar and invaded Europe. The Muslims then began an incredible process of expansion. In just 4 years, they'd colonized almost the whole of Spain, had crossed the Pyrenees, and were only halted at Poitiers in France. Were it not for this reverse, an army which had swept across 2 continents might easily have crossed the English Channel and occupied Britain. The Muslims called the country they came to al-Andalus, the land of the Vandals. This refers to the Germanic tribe who ruled Spain at the time, the Visigoths. Spanish historians have traditionally seen the Muslim invasion of Spain as a terrible and violent attack, an assault on Christian Europe. In fact, here at the Visigothic site of Rocopolis near Madrid, archaeologists have found evidence which offers a rather different explanation.
The city of Rocopolis, in fact, was the royal city founded by the Visigoths in order to demonstrate the power of the new state. Dimensions were spectacular for this period. And this complex is the most important discovery in Western Europe.
What was it at the time that the Muslims were invading? What was the state of the city then?
They found it not only here in this part of Iberia, but in everywhere of the al-Andalus. They founded cities in crisis. Social crisis, of urban crisis. The traditional explanation is this idea that when the Arabs came, the society collapses and the city collapses. It's not true. It's not true. The collapse of the city started during the Visigothic period.
If you read the orthodox Spanish histories, then you'll learn that predatory Muslim hordes forcibly appropriated Visigothic Spain. And there certainly were some invasion battles. But at many places, like here at Rocopolis, it seems that the newcomers were actually welcomed with open arms. We even have treaties where the Visigoths enthusiastically hand over their land in return for effective Muslim protection. When you were excavating, did you find any evidence of violence at the time of the Arab invasion?
We don't have evidence of violence. Not at all. In this area was peaceful, and the archaeology is showing another landscape, another explanation too. The Muslims started to build a new society.
The enthusiasm for learning that the Islamic world had spent years nurturing was about to be transmitted to Europe.
We went into Spain not to fight against the people there, but to save them from the tyranny of the Latins and others that governed them at the time. In al-Andalus, they found a paradise on earth. When the Arabs changed location, changed geography from their inhospitable, barren homeland, and moved to a rich and fertile country, this was to transform the Arab mind. This is the secret of how such a great civilization came to be born.
The foundations of a new society had been laid. A self-confident, progressive and sophisticated civilization had arrived among the failing states of Europe. And the continent's history was about to be transformed. The Muslim invasion of Spain had been swift and effective, but it lacked a strong leadership. The first wave of invaders were North African tribesmen, only recently converted to Islam, and without connections to the power base of Arabia. But this was about to change. In the capital of the Muslim world, a political coup left all the members of the ruling dynasty massacred. All that is except for one, a prince called Abd al-Rahman.
Abd al-Rahman was in his late teens when his family was massacred. He managed to escape the slaughter and fled to the hills west of Damascus.
His mother had been from North Africa, and Abd al-Rahman must have grown up hearing tales of al-Andalus. And so he made a dangerous journey across the Nile and the deserts of Egypt, heading for those distant lands. Abd al-Rahman brought culture and learning from the center of the Islamic world straight to the heart of al-Andalus.
When Abd al-Rahman arrived in Spain, he came here to Cordoba, where the city was in complete disarray. That Roman bridge had collapsed into the river. But Abd al-Rahman set to rebuilding the city. You have to remember that it's in this context that the Arabs arrive, not as marauding destroyers, but sometimes as saviors.
Abd al-Rahman brought cutting-edge technology for irrigation to Spain. Almost immediately, the landscape was transformed. Palm trees, lemon and orange groves, avocados, artichokes and pomegranates, none of which had been seen in Europe. Because of Abd al-Rahman's sophisticated trade network, this new agriculture created huge wealth. And these riches were used to build one of the greatest cities in the world. While the inhabitants of London were still living in wooden houses, the people of Cordoba had built a cosmopolitan city with a population of over 100,000, the largest settlement in Europe. Reports from European visitors to Cordoba describe a city with 70 libraries and over 300 public baths. The accounts tell of houses with running water and roads illuminated by streetlights.
You often have to take medieval sources with a fairly substantial pinch of salt because chroniclers were extremely fond of exaggeration. But in fact, the new excavations here at Cordoba are actually revealing a city that was just as rich as the one that they described. These monumental palace walls belong to a Muslim aristocrat, and this channel over here is part of the water system that brought Cordoba its famously effective sewage works, as well as the fountains and the baths that so impressed all those European visitors.
Cordoba was described by a 10th century German visitor as the ornament of the world.
One of the reasons it's been so difficult to investigate Islamic Cordoba is that the city's been built up on itself like a kind of layer cake. But here, the archaeologists have taken away the modern level to reveal that Islamic layer there, and then down at the bottom, a Roman mosaic.
Abd al-Rahman built Cordoba on top of what had been one of the largest cities in Roman Spain, outshining all that went before. And his greatest achievement was this: the Great Mosque of Cordoba. With a floor space the size of 4 football pitches, this is the largest mosque in Western Islam. The forest of 600 marble columns disappear into the distance, creating a mesmeric infinity effect. On the columns, arches balance on top of one another. Its shell-shaped prayer niche has an extraordinary acoustic, making any word spoken inside audible to the entire congregation.
When the mosque was first built, these archways would have been opened to allow people and light to stream in and out. And this courtyard was a central part of the complex. People would come here to ritually purify themselves before they worshipped, or just to gossip and do business.
Abd al-Rahman's original mosque was only a fraction of the size of the building that stands today. Over a period of 200 years, rulers would extend the mosque 3 times. It's been suggested that the mosque was enlarged because each new ruler of the city wanted to stamp his authority on the building. But there's also a more straightforward explanation. The Cordoba Mosque had to accommodate the burgeoning number of worshippers. The Muslim population of Spain was growing fast. Modern Spain has been reluctant to acknowledge that its indigenous population converted to Islam in droves.
Standard history books present the Muslim occupation of Spain as something that was superficial, just a surface colonisation by an Arab elite, not a presence that had any kind of lasting impact on the bulk of the population. New archaeological evidence is turning that idea on its head.
All over Spain, cities like Cordoba were established. Even Madrid was founded by Muslims. The original Arab walls still stand behind the royal palace.
How far did Muslim communities spread through Spain?
We see remains dating from the time of al-Andalus almost everywhere, not only in the south of Spain, but also in other parts of Spain. There are emerging lots of sites, fortresses, villages, and cities, almost everywhere. People were Arabized, losing the form of Latin they were speaking until then, and they were Islamized in the sense that they dropped Christianity and converted to Islam in massive numbers, really.
Were these forced conversions, or was the idea of Islam particularly attractive?
It's always very difficult to say why someone converts to another religion, isn't it? But I think there is no evidence of any forced conversion at all. In a way, the Islamization and Arabization of territories like al-Andalus is very similar to what happened to the Roman Empire, when people wanted to convert to the values and to the cultural values, to the religious values, and to the way of living of what seemed to be a civilization which had lots of advantages.
I think it's very easy to forget that at this moment in time, Islam is a culture of innovation, isn't it? As you said, it's drawing in ideas from the East.
It's a culture of phenomenal innovation. The opportunities of living because of the market, because of the trade relations and so on, which were much more interesting.
The Islamization of Spain did more than change the name of the god that people worshipped. People converted because this was a religion which had something to offer them. It had wealth, it had social structure, and it had intellectual power.
The Arabs brought in one innovation that did more than any other to change the cultural makeup of Europe, and it's this: paper. The idea almost certainly came from the Chinese via trade exchange, and it is revolutionary technology. Unlike parchment and vellum, it's cheap and it's easy to mass produce, and when the Arabs come to Spain, they start to open paper-making factories. Paper allows you to do three things very effectively. You can gather information, you can analyse and develop ideas in a very precise way, and then you can disseminate your newfound knowledge to a wider world. And in the 10th century, that was a potent mix.
Cordoba's love of books became legendary. Whilst the Royal Library of France contained 900 books in this period, just one of Cordoba's 70 libraries amassed over 500,000. These books contain some of the most sophisticated studies of astronomy in the world.
In Northern Europe at this time there is nothing, but there is nothing that can be considered the result of sophisticated astronomy.
Why do you think Muslim scholars were particularly interested in the heavens and the revolution of the stars?
I think they were interested in science in general terms. For example, calculating the sacred direction. If you have to say your prayers, you must face towards Mecca. Calculating the direction of Mecca from a given place is not so easy. It is a complicated mathematical problem for which the Arabs had exact solutions from the 9th century.
One of the ways in which the Muslims solved these problems was by developing a Greek instrument called the astrolabe. This is a calculator for telling the time of night or day. If it's lined up on a star above the horizon, the angle can be registered with a movable needle. The measurement is then transferred to the reverse side of the astrolabe, where a base plate represents the geographical location. And a star grid, like a map of the heavens, shows the position of the stars. By aligning the needle to the grid using the measurements, the time can be read off the face of the astrolabe, just like a clock. The astrolabe enabled nighttime navigation, which helped to advance sea travel, and this in turn set the stage for the coming era of worldwide exploration and discovery. Cordoban scientists were streets ahead of the rest of Europe, especially when it came to medicine.
This account comes from an Islamic physician who encountered a Christian doctor at work. They brought me a knight who had an abscess on his leg and a woman suffering from consumption. I made a plaster for the knight and the swelling opened and improved. For the woman, I prescribed a diet to revive her consumption. But then the Frankish doctor arrived and objected. "Bring me a strong knight with a well-sharpened battle axe," he said. The knight struck a blow, the marrow of the leg spurted out, and the wounded man died on the spot. As for the woman, their doctor affirmed the devil must have entered her head. Then he grasped a razor and cut an incision in the shape of a cross, exposing the bone of the skull and rubbing salt into the wound. The woman died in the instant. I returned home, having learnt much about the medicine of the Christians.
The hospitals of Cordoba were performing operations which wouldn't be seen in the rest of Europe for hundreds of years. The city's most famous surgeon was a man called Abu Qasis. He spent 40 years compiling a hugely influential medical compendium.
Chapter 30 dealt with surgery, and these are just some of the instruments that were illustrated in that chapter. This is a specialist device used by eye surgeons for the relief of hypertension. And these two over here were employed to perform successful tracheotomies. And in fact, the Abu Qasis method was still popular well into the 20th century.
As well as large scientific collections, more everyday documents have survived from Islamic Cordoba. These give a detailed insight to the society that was created here.
What kinds of things are being recorded on these bits of paper?
In this document there was written everything, absolutely everything.
So does that mean that people in the lower classes of society could read?
Yes, there are poor people with a very good education. The education is a way to be a better Muslim. So being a better Muslim means that you know the Quran and you know everything of the law. The law is not a king law, it is a God law.
Divine law.
Divine law.
Have you got any physical examples of these documents?
Yes, I have one. Well, it is a contract about plowing the land. For 2 years, we have to plant it with wheat and food, and he gets from this proportion of the production. The Muslim give a new thing. The land is mine. I rent you the land, and you give me a part of the production. People are interested not in having hunting lands like a lord or squire in England. The landlord rent his land.
And it's empowering as well, because if you're the lowest rung of society and yet you have some rights to your own land and you can keep a lot of the produce.
Yes.
Every piece of evidence from Cordoba adds to the picture of a civilized and highly sophisticated city. It had medical centres, an organised legal system, and libraries full of academics and scientists working on ideas which were light years ahead of anything else in Europe. By the 10th century, Cordoba had become the official capital of al-Andalus. People flocked here to work, either in the city's shops and markets or on rented land outside. In the year 912, a new ruler came to power. He was to take Cordoba to even greater heights.
Abd al-Rahman III was only 21 when he became ruler of Cordoba. With a resounding statement of self-confidence, he declared himself the Caliph, the commander-in-chief of the faithful. With that title, he claimed to be the supreme leader of the Islamic world. At a stroke, he repositioned Muslim Spain, so it was no longer a Western outpost, but instead a key power in Islam.
And to complement his role as Caliph, Abd al-Rahman III built himself one of the biggest royal palaces in the world. While the English kings of the same period were living in modest wooden halls, Abd al-Rahman III needed 10,000 workmen to construct this enormous palace complex, which was decorated with African white marble. The alabaster palace, surrounded by acres of date palms, was described as a concubine lying in the arms of a black eunuch. It was called Medina al-Zahra, after the Caliph's favourite. Archaeologists have reconstructed barely 10% of the original site.
The idea here is that the Caliph dominates. What he's really doing with the landscape is demonstrating that Medina al-Zahra is the strongest territory in the peninsula. Our excavations reveal the city to be at the cutting edge of technical, architectural and scientific development. Now, to do this on such an enormous scale requires incredible sophistication. Nothing like this existed in the world.
At the centre of the complex lies Abd al-Rahman's throne room.
What do you think drove Abd al-Rahman to build such an opulent place?
Abd al-Rahman had this built during the last year of his life. It was a symbol of consolidation of his economic and political power. Seated in this throne, the Caliph must have felt himself master of all al-Andalus's destiny.
Visitors from all over Europe were received here. A monk from Germany called John of Gauss left a record of his trip.
You have to try and imagine the impression this place would have made on John of Gauss. The walls were studded with tiles made of silver and gold, and on the roof there was a massive representation of the heavens. Mechanical lions roared in the corridors, and in the rafters there were mechanical birds that twittered away. Here in the centre of the room, there were two bowls filled with mercury that would catch the light and then send it shattering back out to dazzle the visitors. This is what was written about the climax of his visit. When John arrived at the dais where the Caliph was seated alone, almost like a godhead, he saw everything draped with rare and costly coverings. They do not use thrones or chairs as other people do, but recline on divans or couches when conversing or eating, their legs crossed over one another. There is actually one detail that this account misses out. The Caliph did have a throne, a mechanical throne, that raised and then descended as if he was levitating among his subjects.
A refined court culture developed in the palace of Medina al-Zahra, and this was to have an unexpected influence on the rest of Europe.
What would the soundscapes of the palaces have been in the 10th century?
Perhaps the most basic level would be the sounds of all the different fountains and small running currents, artificial rivers running from room to room. On top of that, we could have heard layer upon layer of different types of music and singing. A variety of different professional instrumentalists. We could easily have heard a lute player sitting in a corner or in any of the various different entryways. There would be a slightly more formal presentation